Hello, I'm Paul Carroll, technical writer for Digital Photo Magazine, and welcome to this Photoshop Made Easy video tutorial on sharpening images in Photoshop. Sharpening is all about giving more definition to the edges in your image by darkening some pixels and increasing the contrast between the light and dark pixels to give the illusion of a sharper edge. Photoshop can't perform sharpening miracles, unfortunately, and it isn't able to make an out-of-focus image sharp. It'll only add more definitions to objects already in focus. So if your image is already in focus, what's the point of sharpening it any further? Well, no matter how sophisticated your camera kit is, or how tight you keep your digital workflow, as the electronic file of your image is crunched through the image processor and then worked on digitally, definition can be lost, and this is beyond your control. So Photoshop offers several techniques to restore sharpness back to its former glory. And in this video lesson we'll be looking at 3 different techniques to make those edges razor sharp. Using Photoshop Elements, we'll be looking at the differences between using the Unsharp mask, Adjust Sharpness and High Pass filters. If you use the full version of Photoshop, these tools are also at your disposal, and the techniques remain the same, although the filters themselves are located under different menus. But don't worry, we'll point out where you can find them. Okay, let's get started. Open up the start image, spittle.jpg, from off the CD into Photoshop, and you can see I've already got it open on screen. Applying sharpening to an image should always be the last adjustment that you make before printing or outputting the image electronically. The reason for this is the amount of sharpening required is dependent on the image resolution. So the level of sharpening required on a high resolution image, to be printed at A3, will look completely overcooked if it's applied to the same image on a low resolution file, which is destined for the web. A sensible workflow, therefore, is to do all the global adjustments you want at maximum resolution for the best quality, and then make a copy of your image before resizing it ready for its intended output and applying the appropriate level of sharpening. In this technique we'll be looking at applying sharpening appropriate to making an A4 print. So go over to the toolbox and select the crop tool, and in the options bar enter the dimensions of A4, so that will be a width of 29.7 centimeters, a height of 21 centimeters, and a print resolution of 300 pixels per inch. Hit return, and now we can drag the crop marquee over our image and position our crop box wherever we want to make our crop. So I'm going to crop out the left hand side there and tick the green tick to apply that crop. And then if I go up to the File menu and down to Save As, I can save a duplicate copy of this file to apply my sharpening to. So I'll call it Spittle A4 Print Sharpened and click Save. So now I know that all the sharpening that I am applying is on a separate document. The first sharpening technique we're going to look at is using the Unsharp Mask filter, which is probably the tool most Photoshop users are most familiar with. I've just dragged on my layers palette temporarily because I'm going to make a duplicate layer and I'm going to call it Unsharp Mask, and I'm going to apply this technique to a separate layer so that we can have a look at the effect that it's having after we've applied the sharpening. Elements users will find the Unsharp Mask filter under the Enhance menu. So if I go up to Enhance and it's down towards the bottom, we've got Unsharp Mask and Adjust Sharpness that we'll be looking at later. So we just click Unsharp Mask. For those of you with the full version of Photoshop, you'll find this filter under the Filter menu and then under the sub-menu Sharpen. The Unsharp Mask filter works by making a duplicate copy of your image and then applying a blur to the new layer. It then compares the two layers, and any areas of the image with more detail will show up because there's a bigger difference between the normal and the blurred layer. And then by lightening and darkening pixels in these edge areas, the illusion of sharpening occurs. So within the Unsharp Mask filter, these 3 sliders, the amount, radius and threshold, will control how the 2 layers interact with each other and how the contrast, or sharpness, is controlled across the picture. The amount slider controls the level of contrast between the pixels, and if I zoom in on our image to around 100% and increase this amount slider, you'll start to see that on the horizon here, as the amount goes up, we start to get a haloing effect. And if I go all the way up to 500%, you can see that's really apparent. So for high resolution files, an amount of around 100% up to say 150% is fine, although a lower percentage would be more appropriate for low resolution files which are destined for the web. The second slider, the pixels radius slider, determines how many pixels in and out from an edge are affected by the sharpening. So if I zoom out to full screen and then move the dialog box out of the way temporarily so that you can see the driftwood in the bottom of the frame, you can see as I increase the pixel radius slider, more and more pixels are being affected by the increase in contrast. And if we look in the detail areas of the driftwood, increasing the contrast to say around 50 pixels, we start to lose detail in these shadow and highlight areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that radius back down to say 5 pixels. The final slider, threshold levels, dictates how different in contrast the pixels have to be classed as an edge. At a threshold of 0, every pixel is classed as an edge pixel, and as you increase the slider, less and less pixels are being classed as an edge pixel, and are therefore not being affected by the increase in contrast and that sharpening effect. So by increasing the radius and threshold sliders in tandem, increasing the radius will boost the contrast, but then increasing the threshold levels restricts the area that contrast or sharpening is applied to. So you can see that if I go really high on the radius slider and with the threshold levels of 0, we've got a really contrasty effect. But as I boost up the threshold levels, that increase in contrast or sharpening is now only being applied to a smaller edge area. So for this image, if I set the radius to 5 pixels and the threshold levels to 25, and just zoom in to 100% again and scroll around the image, as I turn off and on the preview, you can see there that we're applying some sharpening to the driftwood on the edges there and around the sort of shadow. But if I scroll up to the sky area and turn off and on the preview, you can see that that sharpening effect is having very little effect to the clouds, and so we're only affecting a smaller area that we deem to be an edge. I could probably push the sharpening a little bit further in this image, so if I increase a pixel radius say up to 9 or 10, there you can see that we're really applying a bit more sharpening in the driftwood and starting to bring a bit of sharpness through to those detail areas on the sand. But I would always err on the side of subtlety when applying sharpening, and there's no one particular recipe that suits all images. It's very image dependent. But now you know what the 3 sliders under the unsharp mask filter are doing, you'll be able to make better decision when you're sharpening your images. So I'll just finalise this sharpening level. So I'm going to knock that back down to a radius of 5, click OK, and then it's time for us to look at our second sharpening technique using a new filter which was introduced in Photoshop CS2 and Elements 5, which is called Smart Sharpen in the full version of Photoshop, or Adjust Sharpness in Elements. You'll find it under the same menu as the unsharp mask, so that's under the Enhance menu in Photoshop Elements, or under the Filter Sharpen menu in the full version of Photoshop. I'm just going to drag on my layers palette again and make another duplicate layer of our background layer. This time I'm going to call it Adjust Sharpness, and click OK. Now the sharpening that I'm applying is on this new layer. I'll just drag that off the screen and go back to full screen with our image, and then I can call up the Adjust Sharpness filter. The amount and radius sliders work in exactly the same way as unsharp mask, increasing the amount of contrast between the pixels and setting how many pixels from an edge this contrast is applied to. The difference between Smart Sharpen, or Adjust Sharpness, and unsharp mask is that instead of a threshold slider to determine how many pixels are classed as an edge pixel, Adjust Sharpness gives you more control by removing either Gaussian, lens or motion blur from the filtered layer. And these different options give you more control, and each are designed for removing a different type of blur or sharpening a different type of edge. As we already touched on in the unsharp mask filter, the filter works by creating a second layer which it blurs. An unsharp mask uses a Gaussian layer, so leaving the remove box set to Gaussian sharpening in the Adjust Sharpness box means that the Adjust Sharpness filter will work in exactly the same way as the unsharp mask. Lens blur uses a more advanced algorithm for sharpening, which detects the edges and details in an image and provides finer sharpening of those details with reduced haloing. So you'll be able to apply more sharpening to edges without incurring haloing, than you will with unsharp mask. Motion blur attempts to reduce the effects of blur due to camera or subject movement. So this method is very image dependent and should be used on action shots or possibly of images suffering from a little camera shake. The angle box sets the direction of the motion for the blur correction, and so just type a number into the box or drag the angle dial to change the angle of the motion blur. We don't need to sharpen any motion blur in this image, and we've already used Gaussian blur effectively in the unsharp mask filter, so I'm going to select lens blur, and if I set the same pixel radius in the adjust sharpness filter that I did in the unsharp mask and click OK, and I'll just drag my layers palette onto screen, we can see that by turning off and on the unsharp mask layer, we can see the differences that sharpness has applied. Difficult to see at that view, so if I just zoom into 100%, scroll around so that we can see the top of the driftwood, the beach and some of the sea, you can see that with the unsharp mask filter applied, we have one level of sharpening, and if I uncheck the unsharp mask filter, you can see that our adjust sharpness filter layer is bringing through a lot more sharpness, even screen. I'll just drag it completely onto the screen so you can see it. I'll just touch on one of the advantages of having the sharpening on a separate layer, as we've done here, is not only can we turn off and on the layers to see the different effects, but also we have the control of the layers palette. So if the adjust sharpness filter that we've applied, you thought that's a little bit too strong, instead of having to undo and reapply the sharpening, we can just drop the opacity of the layer, so we can half the effect by dropping it to 50%, and again we can then compare that to the unsharp mask, and you can see even at 50% opacity, the adjust sharpness layer is still bringing through more definition on those edges. Okay, time for our third and final technique. So again, I'll just zoom back out to full screen and make a duplicate copy of the background layer, which I'm going to call high pass. Click OK and just drag that off the screen. You may not have come across the high pass filter as a method of sharpening before, and that wouldn't be surprising because it's located under a different menu and isn't grouped together with the other sharpening filters. Instead, you'll find it under the filter menu, down under the sub menu other, and second one down from the list, high pass, and it's also found in the same location in the full version of Photoshop. This filter works differently to unsharp mask and adjust sharpness filters, and instead filters out low frequency detail in an image, which has the effect of retaining detail in the edge while suppressing the rest of the image. When the filter is applied to an overlay layer, the suppressed areas have no effect on the image underneath, but the edges appear sharper. So this radius slider is determining how wide our edges are, and if I scroll around the preview and increase the pixel radius, you can see more and more pixels are coming through the filtered layer and are visible on the preview. And if I drop it back down to 0.1 pixels, you can see that this grey filter identifies that no pixels are now being brought through. And as we increase the slider again, then we start to see edge details through the filter. And these are the edges which will be overlaid to the background layer and bring out that sharpness. And if I go up to say 10 pixels, you can see that I'm bringing through quite a lot of pixels through the filtered layer. But as I'm applying this filter to a separate layer, again we've got all the control that the layers palette offers us. So if I set it to 10 pixels, it doesn't matter if the effect looks quite strong when we overlay the layer, because I'll be able to drop down the opacity. So I'll just click OK, and I'll drag my layers palette onto the screen. I'll just extend it a little bit and turn off my two sharpening layers which we've already completed, and you can now see that my high pass sharpening layer is sitting on top of the background layer, and at the moment the blending mode is set to normal. So if we just change that blending mode to overlay, you can see that we've overlaid the high pass blending filter on top of the background image, and now we're just bringing through those bits of sharpness from the high pass filtered layer. And then if I zoom into 100%, we can really see the effect that high pass sharpening layer is having by turning the layer off and on. And there you can really see that we're just bringing through sharpness on quite a lot of pixels there, because we set the pixel radius to 10. So if we feel that's a little bit strong, by just dropping the opacity of that layer to say around 50%, the sharpening effect is a little bit more subtle and scroll around, you can see that we're bringing through a fair bit of detail into the driftwood in the foreground, but we're not sharpening the more out of focus beach, sea and sky areas quite as much. So that's all our 3 sharpening techniques covered. But just before we finish, it's worth noting that although the control sliders on the sharpening filters do offer you some degree of control to localize where sharpening is applied and to define what is an edge, to push the sharpening even further in some areas that you really want to highlight, we can combine sharpening filters with selections. So if I select the polygonal lasso tool from the toolbox and make a really quick selection of the driftwood, which is obviously the dominant feature in this photograph and the foreground interest that we want to give some real prominence to. So really quick selection there. I'll then feather that selection, so up to the select menu, down to feather, give it a feather radius of around 50 pixels, which will just give us a nice gradual blend between the sharp and unsharp areas. And then with my background layer highlighted, if I hold down the control key and hit the letter J on the keyboard, I punch my selection of the driftwood onto a new layer, and then I can apply some more sharpening just to that layer. So if I go up to the enhance menu, down to adjust sharpness and amount of 100%, yeah, pixel radius of 10, and remove lens blur, that'll be fine. We'll just apply that sharpening to the selection, and then if I zoom into 100% and scroll around so we can see the driftwood and the beach, you can see that with our layer 1, our selection turned off and on, we're just really adding some more definition to the driftwood, but we're not affecting the sky or the sea because we're on a separate layer and we're just applying that sharpening to our selection. So that's a really good way of just giving some extra definition to particular features within the frame. I really hope you've enjoyed these 3 sharpening techniques.